My friend Alex and I went camping at Red River Gorge last year. He never came back. The police say I made up what happened, a twisted way of coping with losing him. They think it was an accident, or maybe that I'm hiding some horrible truth. But I know what I saw out there. I know there's something in those woods. A creature. A monster. It's out there, hiding in the shadows, watching, waiting. I can still hear the crunch of leaves and the way the night seemed to breathe around us. It started as a perfect autumn hike, the forest glowing red and gold in the setting sun. But when darkness fell, we weren't alone. We thought it was just nerves, or our imaginations running wild in the quiet. But that was before the thing in the woods started stalking us. It was just past midnight when I heard it for the first time. A faint rustling, almost like footsteps circling the edge of our campsite. I opened my eyes and looked over at Alex, who was lying stiff in his sleeping bag, staring wide-eyed at the trees. His breathing was shallow, barely a whisper above the crackling embers of our fire. "Did you hear that?" he murmured, voice trembling. I nodded, my throat too tight to answer. We sat up slowly, peering into the darkness, trying to convince ourselves it was just a deer or a raccoon. But the sounds were too careful, too deliberate, as if whatever was out there knew exactly where we were. Then, just as quickly as it started, the rustling stopped. Silence filled the air again, thick and oppressive. We waited, our ears straining, but there was nothing. Alex exhaled, his shoulders relaxing as he mumbled something about going back to sleep. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been out there was still watching us, lurking just beyond the reach of our firelight. By morning, the fear had faded, almost like a bad dream that didn't quite stick. The golden sunlight trickled through the trees, painting the forest in a warm glow that made everything seem safe again. Alex and I exchanged uneasy smiles as we packed up our gear, shrugging off the strange sounds from the night before. Maybe we just psyched ourselves out. It was easy to let the dark play tricks on your mind. We decided to take the Auger Ridge Trail that morning, known for its sweeping views and jagged cliff faces. The trail felt like the perfect way to ground ourselves, to let the beauty of the gorge erase the eerie feelings that lingered. We hiked along the narrow path, laughing off our shared paranoia, enjoying the crunch of leaves underfoot and the crisp autumn air. As we reached a clearing, we stopped to take in the view. The gorge stretched out below, a stunning cascade of fiery reds and deep greens. For a moment, it felt like we'd escaped whatever darkness had brushed against us last night. But as we continued up the trail, a nagging feeling crept back in. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no wind, just the sound of our footsteps echoing through the trees. As we rounded a bend, the trail dipped back into a dense stretch of woods, and the comforting sunlight faded under the thick canopy. Shadows stretched long across the ground, and a chill pricked my skin. I tried to shake the feeling creeping up my spine, but then I heard it. A faint stirring in the leaves, not too far off. I stopped, grabbing Alex's arm. "You hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely steady. Alex paused, listening, then shrugged, giving me a reassuring smile. "Probably just a deer, or maybe a fox," he said, squeezing my shoulder. "This place is full of wildlife, don't worry." I nodded, but something about the sound felt wrong. As we moved on, I kept glancing over my shoulder, catching the barest hint of movement in the distance. The rustling started again, closer now, and it seemed to follow us, stopping whenever we did, and picking up again when we walked. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just passing through, it was following us. Every step sent a fresh wave of dread down my spine. After another hour of hiking, we came upon a shallow natural cave, a perfect spot to set up camp for the night. The rock face overhead offered some shelter, and the area felt secluded. Alex set off to gather firewood while I unpacked our gear, arranging our things to make the space as comfortable as possible. As I finished unrolling the sleeping bags, I heard leaves rustling somewhere in the distance. Assuming it was Alex on his way back, I went back to my work, but the footsteps sounded strange, light, almost fleeting, like something or someone was darting through the leaves. Then as suddenly as they'd started, the footsteps broke off, disappearing into the silence. Moments later, Alex emerged from the opposite direction, carrying another bundle of wood. He was whistling, completely unfazed. My heart lurched. Whatever had been moving out there, it hadn't been him. "Hey, everything okay?" he asked, noticing my expression as he dropped the wood by the fire pit. "Alex, I heard footsteps," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Just now. I thought it was you, but it was coming from the other direction, and they ran off right before you got here." He raised an eyebrow, glancing over his shoulder into the darkening woods, then back at me with a reassuring smile. "Sarah, it's probably just an animal. This place is full of them. You're spooking yourself." I shook my head, my hands fidgeting as I tried to explain. "No, it was different, Alex. It sounded like someone was following us. First on the trail, now here." My voice cracked, and I could feel my pulse pounding. Alex stepped closer, putting a hand on my shoulder. "Hey, look at me," he said, his voice calm. "It's just us out here, okay? I'll keep the fire going tonight. Whatever you're hearing, I promise you, is nothing that can't be explained." But even as he said it, I could see a flicker of doubt in his eyes, and as the firelight danced across the mouth of the cave, the shadows seemed to stretch just a little too far. After we finished our meager dinner, Alex tended to the fire, piling a few larger logs onto the embers to keep it burning through the night. The warmth and steady crackling sound, along with the clear, star-studded sky above us, calmed my nerves. Slowly, I drifted off, the tension of the day slipping away as sleep took over. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when I felt a hand shaking my shoulder. My eyes flew open, and there was Alex, wide-eyed, whispering urgently. "I heard something," he said, barely above a murmur. It sounded like sticks breaking, just over there in the trees. He pointed to the edge of the campsite, his voice tense but steady. A chill swept over me, and immediately, my mind flashed back to the rustling footsteps I had heard earlier. Every nerve in my body was on high alert as I sat up, scanning the dark edges of the trees. Alex had his flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness, darting back and forth as he listened, peering into the shadows. For a moment, it was silent except for the crackling of the fire. Then, just beyond the circle of light, I thought I caught the faintest rustling, barely there, like someone moving through the underbrush but trying to stay hidden. My heart raced, my breath coming quick and shallow. Alex and I exchanged a glance, and in his eyes, I could see he was no longer dismissing it as just an animal. Something was out there. "Stay here. Keep the light steady," Alex whispered, gripping one of the smoldering logs from the fire. He flicked his flashlight off, nodding toward the edge of the woods. "I'm going to get close, see if I can catch it off guard." My heart pounded as I held the flashlight steady on the spot he'd pointed out, illuminating the edge of the trees. Alex slipped down the hill quietly, moving just at the edge of my light's reach. I could barely make out his figure as he neared the trees, and then, in one quick movement, he stepped into the shadows. Suddenly, there was a loud rustling, and whatever had been lurking there bolted deeper into the woods. Alex turned his flashlight back on, its beam bouncing wildly as he sprinted after it. My light caught a flicker of movement, just for a second, but it was enough. I saw a figure, barely visible, dressed in dark, earth-toned clothing vanishing into the trees. "Alex, stop! Come back!" I screamed, my voice cracking, but he didn't even turn. He kept chasing, his light flashing sporadically through the dense trees, growing fainter with each step. I strained to listen, my breath held tight, but after a few moments, his footsteps faded into nothing, leaving me alone with only the sound of my own heartbeat echoing through the silence. The wait felt like an eternity, each second stretching longer than the last. The forest was silent, the fire crackling softly beside me. Then, finally, I saw it. Alex's flashlight, a steady beam cutting through the darkness, aimed directly at me. Relief washed over me at first, but it quickly faded when I realized he wasn't saying anything. He just kept walking, the light fixed on me, growing closer. "Alex?" I called, squinting, trying to make out his face beyond the blinding beam, but he didn't respond. The light stayed on me, unwavering, unblinking, illuminating every inch of me while he stayed hidden in the shadows. A strange unease settled over me, tightening in my chest. My heart pounded as I forced myself to ask, "Alex? Are you okay?" Nothing. Only the beam, sharp and unyielding, keeping me pinned in its glare. I shifted uncomfortably, nerves buzzing. Something felt horribly wrong, and my stomach twisted with a dread I couldn't explain. I squinted, trying to see past the light, but all I could see was that beam, focused solely on me. "Alex, this isn't funny," I shouted, my voice wavering. I could feel tears stinging my eyes, a sense of dread clawing at my insides. The silence was suffocating, and the flashlight beam remained fixed on me, unyielding, as if studying me. Then, just as my fear began to tip into panic, the light flicked off. I blinked, my vision swimming in the sudden darkness as my eyes struggled to adjust. Shadows danced across the edge of the firelight, and the trees seemed to close in around me. My breath hitched, my chest tight with fear as my vision finally cleared. And then, I saw it. The figure standing there, just barely visible in the fire's dim glow, wasn't Alex. The shape was wrong. Too tall, too still. It loomed, silent and unblinking, watching me with an unnatural intensity. My blood went cold as I realized it wasn't my friend who had come back. My hand shook, and I stumbled back, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from that dark figure, rooted in place by a terror so profound it left me paralyzed. I sat frozen, my mind racing but my body locked into place as the figure lingered just beyond the firelight, a silent, hulking shadow. Every part of me screamed to run, but the darkness surrounding us felt too vast, too full of unknown horrors, and the thought of what it might have done to Alex held me there, gripped in a kind of terror that swallowed me whole. The creature then lowered itself, crouching down, its face finally catching the glow of the fire. My stomach twisted as I took in its features. It wasn't a man. The face staring back at me was stretched and elongated, more animal than human, with a dog-like snout covered in thick, dark brown fur, and those eyes, two sickly yellow orbs reflecting the firelight with an unnatural glimmer. Realization hit me like a cold slap. The brown I'd seen earlier wasn't clothing. It was fur. This thing had never been human. Horrified, I turned over, yanking my blanket up to my chin, curling in on myself as if it could somehow protect me. I lay there trembling, waiting for the inevitable. The lunge, the sharp pain of claws or teeth, but nothing happened. The creature just stayed there, crouched, watching me in silence. Time seemed to stretch, every second feeling like an eternity as I shook under my blanket, my breath shallow, my mind on the edge of breaking. But still, it didn't move. It just stayed there, keeping its vigil over me, as if it had all the time in the world. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to erase the creature's face from my mind. But those eyes, the sickly yellow glow, piercing and unblinking, were seared into my memory. It sat there for hours, crouched just at the edge of the firelight, watching me in the silence that felt like it was consuming me whole. Every second stretched and twisted, each heartbeat feeling like it could be my last. The terror was so intense, I thought it might kill me right there in the darkness. I lay there, shaking, clutching the blanket as if it could protect me, my mind spiraling in endless fear. But the creature never moved. It just stayed there, its eyes drilling into me, studying me with a patience that was somehow worse than anything it could have done. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard it shift. My heart hammered as I listened to it stand, its massive form looming in the dim glow of the fire. For one awful moment, I thought it was coming toward me, but then, slowly, it turned, and I heard its heavy footsteps fading away, each one feeling like a small mercy. Only when the forest returned to silence did I dare open my eyes, my heart still racing as I stared into the empty woods, too afraid to move, too numb to comprehend I'd survived the night. I stayed curled up, clutching the blanket, listening to every small sound, every crackle of the dying fire. It felt like hours before I finally worked up the courage to turn around, to face the space where the creature had crouched, watching me. I slowly lifted my head and looked over my shoulder. It was gone. The sun was starting to rise, casting soft light through the trees, a light that felt like salvation. I let out a shaky breath, feeling my whole body begin to release the terror that had gripped me. That thing, whatever it was, had kept me frozen in terror for over 4 hours. The longest, most horrifying hours of my life. The moment the forest was bright enough, I scrambled to my feet. I didn't even bother with the campsite, leaving everything behind as I bolted down the trail. My heart pounded, adrenaline surging, and tears streamed down my face as I ran. I didn't look back. I couldn't. All I knew was that I had to get as far away from that place as possible. Branches scraped my arms, and roots snagged my feet, but nothing slowed me down. The fear pushed me forward, every step taking me further from the nightmare I'd somehow survived. As I tore down the trail, my vision blurred by tears, I suddenly stumbled upon a pair of hikers making their way up from the direction I'd come. The sight of other people, real human people, nearly broke me. I collapsed before them, trembling, my body giving in to the weight of fear and exhaustion. The hikers rushed over, their faces etched with alarms as they knelt beside me. They asked what had happened, if I was hurt, but I couldn't speak. The terror choked my words, the images of the night still too raw, too vivid. I sat there, gasping, trying to steady my breath, until finally the lump in my throat loosened enough to speak. Something attacked my friend Alex, I whispered, my voice barely audible. The hikers exchanged a look, a mixture of concern and disbelief, but they didn't question me. One of them offered me a bottle of water, and after a few moments, they guided me back down the trail. Every step felt like agony, my body heavy with the shock and fear of what I'd endured. It took 2 hours to reach the parking lot, 2 hours where I glanced back over my shoulder more times than I can count, fearing that I'd see those sickly yellow eyes watching me again. When we finally reached the lot, I climbed into my car, my hands still trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. With a second thought, I drove straight to the nearest police station, the fear still fresh in my mind as I prepared to file my report. After filing my report, the officers exchanged weary glances before one of them asked me to accompany them back to the campsite. They didn't say it outright, but I could see it in their faces. They didn't believe a word I'd said. To them, I was just some distraught girl, maybe imagining things after a traumatic night. But despite their disbelief, they agreed to look into it. An officer escorted me back through the trail, my heart pounding with each step. When we reached the campsite, I showed them where Alex had gone into the woods and the spot where I'd last seen him. The officer looked around, taking notes, his face carefully blank. He finally nodded, saying they'd open an investigation into Alex's disappearance, but I could tell by his tone that he didn't expect to find anything. As he escorted me back to the parking lot, my eyes darted constantly to the surrounding trees, every rustling leaf and shadowed branch sending a fresh wave of dread through me. I half expected to see that creature lurking, watching, waiting to strike. But the woods remained still, eerily quiet as we walked. When we finally reached the lot, I climbed into my car, forcing myself to breathe, to focus. The officer gave me a final nod and a reminder to call if I remembered anything else, but I barely heard him. The moment I could, I turned the key, pulling out of the lot and driving home, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. All I could think of was Alex, lost somewhere in those woods, and the thing that had taken him. The call came the next day. I could barely bring myself to pick up, a sick feeling twisting in my stomach as the officer's voice came through the line, calm and practiced. They'd found Alex's body at the base of a cliff. He said it was a long fall, and that Alex's body had been badly mangled upon impact. I felt numb, the words barely registering as I listened. My mind raced back to the creature I'd seen, its yellow eyes glowing in the firelight, the way it had stalked us through the trees. I tried to tell them again, to make them understand that what had happened to Alex wasn't just a fall. I told them about the monster, about how he had chased him into the woods, but they dismissed it just as quickly as before. The officer's tone was sympathetic but firm. "People die out here every year," he said. "The cliffs are steep, and at night, it's easy to lose your footing." He wouldn't believe me. None of them would. To them, Alex's death was just another tragic accident, a case closed. But I knew the truth. Something had haunted us, something that drove Alex over that cliff. As I hung up, a hollow feeling settled in my chest. I was left with the terrible certainty that the monster in those woods was still out there, lurking, waiting for whoever was unfortunate enough to cross its path next. Breaking the news to Alex's parents was one of the hardest things I've ever done. His mother's face twisted with grief as the words left my mouth, and she collapsed, sobbing, unable to bear the weight of the loss. His father just stared at me, his expression dark and accusing, as if he somehow thought I was to blame. I couldn't find the words to defend myself, not that they would have helped. I'd been there, and Alex hadn't come home. That was all that mattered. Since that day, I haven't been able to set foot on a trail. The thought of being out in the woods again sends a shiver down my spine, and even the sight of a forest from a distance makes my skin crawl. I can't sleep either, not peacefully. When I close my eyes, I'm back at that campsite, under the cruelly bright moon, with the creature crouched just at the edge of the firelight, staring at me with those sickly yellow eyes. Sometimes I lie awake, wondering why it let me go, why it didn't finish me off when it had the chance. The question gnaws at me, but I know I'll never have an answer. All I know is that it's out there, waiting in the dark, and no one will ever believe me.